So this is the final roundtable, and as I said, if there is any kind of method, we've been throwing this word around, it was to start big picture, give a foundation, get people up to speed, create something close to a common vernacular so we can communicate in this room, if only to disagree, at a intelligible level of discourse, and I think we achieved that. And the idea is to keep drilling down deeper into the various issues that quantum mechanics have, I think, basically made unavoidable. I've said this before, and I really do think that we're in a quantum age. The weird thing is, previous ages would last how long? Sometimes hundreds, thousands of years. We talked about the Bronze Age, the Stone Age. So the idea of a quantum and an age together is might be somewhat specious, but it is, I think, the way to capture this convergence of these four different revolutions that we've been talking about, or stages, that have come from the theoretical and experimental breakthroughs in quantum, but also how it's converged, as we've seen from so many of the panels that weren't directly related to quantum physics, of the philosophical, of the humanities, of the biological, not just simply the natural sciences and the social sciences, and that there is something, if not akin to a Newtonian moment or age, that deserves our attention, and as I said, the reason why these panels are speculative, to try to look ahead and anticipate what comes next and what the implications are. What the implications are, particularly because my field of expertise is peace and security studies, but also more broadly for our own identities, the sense that our own identities, we've learned in so many of these panels, are implicated by quantum, and be it at the level of consciousness or in how we cross borders, or where we make that little line that has been drawn over and over again between the classical and the quantum. So for all those reasons, I think I am wholly heartened and satisfied and indeed enthused to prepare for Quantum 4, because I think we have made, and I promised I would only use this word once, a quantum leap. I think we have, over the previous quantum symposia, made some breakthroughs here. And I'm really looking forward to editing them and putting them into a collection. So there's a couple themes that we're going to be talking about. I'm going to bring them up in the conclusion. But right now I want to turn to this panel, because their task is, as I sent it in an email, is not simply to try to make sense of this or to somehow synthesize or wrap it up, but really to maintain the dialogical nature of this gathering and bring their own expertise, their own fields of study to bear, and tell us, frankly, I said, be frank, be candid, be Colin White, and tell us what you really think about these issues. And we're very fortunate because these people come from different aspects, the fields of peace and security and of international relations. And if nothing else, this has been a pluralist undertaking, and I think the plurality of this panel will help us, I think, get a better grip on how many of these ideas have traction for peace and security. So that's sort of their marching orders. I think we're going to start in the order of the panel.
Frankly, I feel a little uneasy to speak in a concluding session that is supposed to comment on what we have heard in the symposium. I know something about war, but close to nothing about quantum theory or technology. All I can say is that I came here skeptical and come out on this slightly less so regarding the connection between quantum theory and the topic of peace and security. It is an old rationalistic principle that everything is connected to everything else in some way. So some connections clearly exist, but what they are may appear like a wild geese chase. I'm an Israeli Jew, and the Jews were always speculating among themselves as to how a seemingly irrelevant thing might affect their precarious existence. This was humorously described as the elephant in the Jewish question. And I don't mean the Republican Party. So how may quantum affect peace and security? I begin with the conceptual level, and here we have heard many things that fall under the categories of metaphors, analogies, inspirations, vocabulary and perhaps even insights drawn from quantum theory and influencing other fields such as the social sciences. Without dismissing the significance of all these, and they are not insignificant, I'm not sure that they have or will have a cardinal significance in the transition from the micro to the macro world. In this, I'm close to the spirit, I think, of Jairus' opening lecture. I've not yet read Venn, so maybe I may or may not need to revise my initial stand on this. The sphere of quantum technology and its influence on our lives, including the topics of war and peace, seems far more significant. In this, quantum technology continues earlier technological revolution that it had each tremendous impact on the world. The first industrial revolution drew on the enormous increase in productivity and mobility brought about by the steam engine, and on the real-time connectivity provided by the electric telegraph. The second industrial revolution from the end of the 19th century on is mostly associated with the internal combustion engine, and its no less enormous boost to mobility as well as with radio communication. Each of these revolutions had a huge effect on all aspects of life, including, of course, the conduct of war. The third industrial technological revolution, through which we currently live, is the so-called electronic, information, robotic revolution that has been unfolding since about the middle of the 20th century. Into this revolution, quantum technology have entered from nuclear weapons to computing to enciphering to hopefully quantum computers. One cannot exaggerate the significance of nuclear weapons to the post-1945 world. They were a quantum leap, speaking metaphorically, in international relations and security. And the other technologies mentioned have had and clearly will have a far-reaching effect on the conduct of war. Experts can vaguely sketch out the outline of the resulting changes in military technology and the conduct of war. And yet the impact of quantum technologies on the subject of this symposium, peace and security, is more problematic, because as in the past, it is tied up, entangled, to use another metaphor, in a reciprocal relationship with other changes in other spheres, economic, social, political, and normative. For example, we talk about the so-called long peace between the great powers since 1945, 70 years to date, which is attributed to the nuclear factor that supposedly prevented the Cold War from turning hot. But little noticed, the second longest peace between the great powers occurred between 1871 and 1940, 43 years. And the third longest peace proceeded between 1815 and 1854, 39 years. Thus, the three longest periods of great power peace all took place after 1815 and in an ascending order. Two of them preceded the nuclear age, and nothing like them had existed before 1815. So although modern technology is largely associated in people's mind with weapons of war, other, no less significant factors similarly associated with the industrial technological age, such as economic development, commercial interdependence, and political liberalism, have brought about a marked decrease and ultimately a disappearance of war within the developed world. War survives only between undeveloped or developing countries and between them and developed countries. And by the way, we have no time to expand on this, but war has declined not because it has become more lethal and destructive, as people wrongly believe. It hasn't, but because peace has become more profitable. Thus, broadly speaking, the greater its contribution to economic development and affluence, the more quantum technology is likely to be intertwined, entangled with the economic, social, and political developments that work against war. At the same time, it is necessary to remember that not all parts of the world have reached developed status. States and non-state organizations in societies that so far failed in the process of modernization or react against it, or put forward a different version of it, as China and Russia do at present, and Germany did a century ago, are variably less affected by the process of pacification. Here, weapons based on quantum technology might come into their own on both sides. Indeed, non-state organizations might use the democratization of technology, quantum, cyber, as well as, for example, biological weapons, to cause great damage, which could well go far beyond mere affects. Thus, quantum technology has a variety of potential effects, and it cannot be considered alone. Interacting with other major developments and allowing for contingency, it might have various and perhaps conflicting impact on peace and security, as earlier technologies have had. This symposium is an essential attempt to peer into the future, which is proverbially, and all the more so in a world understood in terms of quantum indeterminacy, very difficult to predict. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Karen.
I come here from the field of global environmental change research, which is very interdisciplinary, and for more than 25 years I've been looking at climate change and what it means for humans and society. And I'm particularly interested in what it means for human security, which I define as the capacity of individuals and groups to respond to threats to their environmental, social, and human rights. So I come at this from a very social science-based perspective, but I'm looking really at how we can successfully adapt to climate change and how we can, to successfully adapt, transform at a rate, scale, and magnitude that is unprecedented. So what I want to do is really contextualize this meeting here on why I think that a quantum paradigm shift is absolutely necessary as part of our transformation to sustainability. And I'm going to tell you the story from the IPCC Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change perspective, and which is also a very revolutionary idea that human influence on the climate system is clear, and recent anthropogenic emissions of greenhouse gases are the highest in history. And we know that recent climate changes have had widespread impacts. And this is like, for the first time, we're recognizing that we as humans can actually change global systems. And I will argue that this is not trivial. And we have evidence of this. Over the past century and a half, surface air and ocean temperatures have increased by 0.85 degrees Celsius, which is very significant over a short period of time. We also have evidence that sea levels have risen by 19 centimeters since about 1900. Corresponding to this, we know that greenhouse gas emissions of carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide have increased steadily, and particularly over the last 40 years, to be at a higher rate than they have been in over 140,000 years. So these are really significant changes that are going on now, and we're attributing them with high certainty to humans. When we look towards the future, we start to see that there are different scenarios, and these scenarios are based on emissions projections, and they're based on some assumptions about society. And what we see is there's a number of different scenarios, but there are two up there that are really important. And the red one it's called Representative Concentration Pathway 8.5 watts per square meter, and it reflects a change by the end of this century of around 4 degrees Celsius increase in temperatures. The blue curve is RCP 2.5, and it represents a less than 2 degree temperature increase. And whenever I say, oh, that's a great graph, we should go for that one, people say, oh, that's highly improbable. How will we ever get to 2.5? And after Paris, they've lowered the bar to 1.5 as the goal. So how do we get from RCP 2 to RCP 2.6? And this puts us in a position where the choices that we make today really matter in terms of which curve we're going to be following. So with substantial mitigation, that blue curve, we could get to a world that will look like on the left, where temperatures are around 2 degrees. And I don't want to trivialize what a 2-degree world looks like. It is still dangerous climate change for many groups and vulnerable populations. So it's not, it's it's looking like it's the best case scenario, but it still requires tremendous adaptation and tremendous losses as well. But if we look on the right side, without additional mitigation, we see a world that we can hardly recognize, where the security threats that we've been talking about for these days are magnified. Climate change is considered a threat multiplier. It's one of many stressors, but it is something that is going to have profound implications for natural and social systems. So the line that I think is the most important that comes out of the IPCC synthesis report is that without additional mitigation efforts beyond those in place today, and even with adaptation, warming by the end of the 21st century will lead to high to very high risk of severe, widespread, and irreversible impacts globally. And we say that with high confidence. So the message is really clear coming from this, the science. And where are we? Well, if you look at the way emissions have been going over the last years, we see that we're tracking along the highest emissions scenario. We're going right along RCP 8.5. 2015 was a little bit of a decrease because of the situation in China. But people look at these curves and they say, wow, we actually need to make a quantum leap or a sea change of changes in order to hold climate change to the best possible scenario. And many people will say, oh, we don't have time to do this. If we look at the window for action, you see that it's not very wide. The total carbon budget of 790 gigatons is already used up by 515. There's a small amount that can be remaining to be used. And we know that we already have fossil fuel reserves exceed this by a factor of 4 to 7, and the resources are much larger still. So odds are really not looking in our favor that we can avoid that type of change. So my concern then is, how do we do it? What do we actually do? If we look at the narrative that's coming from the IPCC, from Working Group 1, it tells us that humans are the problem, that we are driving these changes. So human activities and anthropogenic influences are key in climate change impacts. If we look at Working Group 2, which I've been involved with over the last decade, we start to see that impacts, vulnerability, and adaptation tell us that these are really going to be significant for human security, for settlements, for species, for urban areas, etc. And when we go to Working Group 3, which is on mitigation, it tells us that technology is the solution. It tells us that we have the technologies, we have to change human behaviors, but then, it puts, instead of putting humans as the solution to climate change, we get technologies. And I would argue that climate change is not a technical problem that we can solve with better know-how, better management, better expertise. It's what's called an adaptive challenge, which is about our mindsets. It's about our beliefs, our values, our worldviews, and it's about questioning our individual and shared beliefs about the way that the world works. And this is exactly what we've been talking about these days, and how we relate to each other and to the future and how we influence that future. So adaptive challenges really involve challenging dominant paradigms. And they're not just personal about our individual and collective views, but they're political because they involve challenging the given, challenging the assumptions that are kind of thrown down on us, that change is impossible, or you don't make a difference, or it's only up to geoengineering. And geoengineering is the logical outcome of an old paradigm that says the only thing we can do is actually put solar radiation management, et cetera. So political challenges also mean that we have to launch alternatives. And the conversations we're having here, I think, are really important in terms of the alternatives, because there are a lot of social assumptions and constraints in this classical story. And this is what brings me to quantum social theory, and why I'm very enthusiastic about it as a way forward. Because the classical assumptions are that humans are completely material, mental states are nothing but brain states, consciousness is an illusion or epiphenomenal, and that humans are individual, biologically and mentally separate. There's this subject-object dualism, and nature itself is something separate or out there that we need to kind of manage and control, and we've got to fix the climate out there. There's no role in this story for experience, meaning, or purpose. Things that subjectivity that depends on consciousness is really not included in the analyses. And furthermore, there's really no explicit recognition of free will. Choice is an illusion. And so when we get to that point where we have to choose the future, and free will is an illusion, that's a problem. It sees humans then as machines or zombies, as we saw last night, that, which is also a problem. But it really kind of takes determinism to its full extreme and looks at, how are we going to get there. So what I think is really exciting, and the reason that I traveled all the way from Oslo on a long flight, high carbon miles, is to actually think about what if these assumptions are actually wrong, and what does this mean for climate science? And I would argue that quantum social science has enormous significance for climate change, and for three reasons, and I'll just go through these quickly. But methodologically, we start to see that methodologies that allow for subjectivity, and this is quantum decision making, quantum game theory, but also something called Q methodology, which I've been using in my research to look at subjective attitudes, and it actually is derived from, it's influenced by quantum, hence Q. And this is really important because these are used in the models, the rational choice theory, and it's very much a paradigm that is not giving people and the perspective for radical social change into those scenarios that I showed you. It's also important from a metaphorical perspective because when we start to talk about ourselves as entangled, when we start to recognize that the boundaries between subject and object are subjective, and that we are actually, intra-acting with each other, as Karen Barad would say, you start to see that the story changes, and narratives are really important in the climate change story in terms of empowering people or disempowering people. And I turn to Alex Wendt's work on quantum mind and social science as a way that actually adds meaning into the whole dialogue, discourse on climate change, because he really shows that at the end of the day, through quantum consciousness theory, panpsychism, and a number of other arguments, it makes that we are actually meaningful in the universe, and we actually do make a difference, and we are actually, collapsing that wave function into different ways. So I think that in many ways, what quantum social science points to, and I see that there's lots of disagreement and there's a lot of unknowns in there, but those unknowns really can start an important new dialogue on what the role of people are in climate change. And for me, the bottom line is that we matter a lot more than we think. If you look on just classical social science, network theory, you see that we do influence other people outside of our regular, sphere of influence. That our connections go beyond what we can actually see. Agent-based modeling shows that it takes only 10% of people with a minority opinion to actually shift the whole system into that being the majority. So there are things of like, wow, it's not social change is not linear. And if we start to apply some of the knowledge and some of the insights from quantum physics into social theories, I think we can get a much wider ranging dialogue. And last summer I was asked by an editor of Science to ask what can individuals do? How can we motivate individuals for change? And what I came up with is that it's political agency that we actually need. And political agency not just in voting, but political agency in recognizing that we actually influence others, that we actually can question these paradigms and assumptions that are thrown at us and that we've actually been socialized into. And I think that idea of agential realism or participatory realism or just methodologically different things can actually change the way people engage with climate change. And if there's anything we need right now, it's people at all levels engaging with climate change. So at the end of the day, I think it's time for not just a quantum revolution, but a quantum social revolution. And I'm really happy to be here to hear all of these different insights on this. And I end with a quote from Wendt, who says that if human beings really are quantum, then classical social science is essentially founded on a mistake, and social life will therefore require a quantum framework for its proper understanding. And I think the stakes are so high with climate change that it's a discussion and dialogue that is worth taking to its fullest extent. So thanks for inviting me here.
I've been sort of watching this over the last couple of days in just amazement, I guess. My background's in international relations, but I mostly study and do journalism and media now. And I'm neither clearly a physicist or a social theorist. These two discourses that have been existing in parallel here are really out of my context, and it's I would say humbling as an outsider being amongst this kind of rare expertise. But the challenge I've found in trying to engage with this is a disconnect between this very particular expertise that exists in these communities and the what I would say urgent framing of this conference that James put forward to us at the beginning, which I would paraphrase as the analogy of the ethical imperative in unleashing the power of the atom a century ago, right? What's the analogy to this moment now? And how does this matter in the context of power in the international system? I've recently been really interested in this relationship between digital technologies and power, and in particular in a tension between two questions, which I would phrase as are individuals and groups empowered in new ways by digital technologies, and if so, how and to what effect? And then the inverse, or the other side of that tension, are established institutions co-opting digital networks and reasserting existing power structures. And I've sort of been writing about this in various ways, and I kind of want to just give a couple of stories about how that I think illustrate these two sides of this tension, and then maybe raise some questions about how this quantum conversation might apply to them. So the first narrative is around control. Several years ago, I attended a training session for a software program called Palantir. I wanted to learn what this thing was about, so I signed up for a How Do You Use Palantir training session. And it turned out I was the only civilian there. It was all US intelligence clients, potentially, who were there being trained. Palantir was co-founded by a self-described techno-libertarian Silicon Valley billionaire named Peter Thiel. And the general tool pulls together as much data as possible and tags it and tries to make sense of it. So obviously a powerful tool for the intelligence services. At this training session, we were taken through an investigation using this tool of Palantir. Each of us got a workstation with 2 screens, and data sets were provided to us of a mythical combat zone in the Middle East. Known insurgents, daily intelligence reports, satellite imagery, real-time surveillance, all these sorts of data were fed into us. And one by one, as each of these new layers of information was given to us, a new capability of this program, an analytic capability of this program was revealed to us. And in this process, I think the mythology of Palantir and of these sorts of algorithmic tools was revealed. That with more data can come more clarity. In our final exercise of this whole training program, we were told by the program that a known insurgent was going to be meeting with a known bomb maker, and the location and time that was going to happen, and then the exercise ended. The next stage in real life of that simulation would clearly be violent, right? So the algorithm would have produced a scenario in which we would have reacted in a violent way. Either we with agency or as an automated system would have done it. I would argue that for states, the attractiveness of this approach, or of these kinds of tools, is grounded in the mentality that one can control a battlefield through situational awareness. So the more one knows, the more one can control outcomes. And to do this, you need 2 things. You need a tremendous amount of data, and you need tools to give them meaning. So we know where all this data comes from, and increasingly we know the new sources that it's coming from network cameras and sensors, persistent surveillance systems, satellites, Internet of Things. We know these data sources are coming, but they're useless without these tools to bring meaning to them. And this is, of course, where certain algorithmic tools like machine learning and artificial intelligence come in, and are built on top of these data sources to do things like trace and record and flag irregular movements, detect patterns of behavior outside socially constructed norms, predict future events, and more to actually kill in an automated way. And I only raise this piece of the control narrative, this narrative of control, because I think Palantir and tools like it give us a window into how the state has chosen to react and behave in the digital space. I would argue that threatened by the capabilities of perceived nefarious digital actors, states have sought to control the network itself, to, as they claim, collect it all, process it all, exploit it all, partner it all, sniff it all, and know it all in the digital realm. And this is leading to I would argue, some serious consequences. The second narrative or story is the inverse of that, which is around empowerment. And I've been studying a little bit and engaging with a pretty remarkable group called Telecomics. I don't know if anybody has heard of them, but they're kind of similar. They're similar. They're a group, a hacking collective that's quite similar to Anonymous. Their motto is that if Anonymous destroys things and they build things using these hacking communities. So when Mubarak shut down the internet, which is sort of a well-known story for a few days during the uprising, Telecomics came in and tried to bring communications back to Cairo. And they did it some really creative, interesting ways. They partnered with a hacker-friendly French internet service to set up a bunch of dial-up modems. They used a network of amateur radio enthusiasts to help activists communicate with each other. They set up fax machines in universities so that people could get messages out to the broader community, right? So they kind of just did this patchwork, networked solution to the internet going down. And I would argue that this type of thing in conflicts, these types of organizations the Telecomics wasn't alone. Just in Syria, for example, Anonymous was hacking autocratic websites, digital humanitarians and crisis mappers were documenting tank locations, citizens were live streaming atrocities, cryptocurrencies were offering financial support, right? So, and I would argue this actually presents us with a new layer inside these conflict environments. And a layer that doesn't fit comfortably in our traditional categories of international actors. They're not nation states, they're not formal institutions, they're not rogue individuals. And I think they share a set of characteristics and capabilities that at some level anyway are fundamentally technology enabled. And I can talk more about some of those capabilities might be. But critically to how they are empowered is they're empowered in ways that sit outside of and challenge our 20th century hierarchical organizations. And at their core, I think they show that collective action is possible without centralization and hierarchical structure. And this presents a real challenge for the current international institutions and orders that are based on those hierarchical institutions. So this is the tension between these two, this arms race really between these two forces that I think the quantum question comes into. So for me, the big question then is whether quantum technologies, as they manifest themselves, will prove emancipatory or whether they'll reconcentrate power on the people who develop them and own them and have access to them. And these are some of the bigger questions I think we haven't really dove into here. So I would just pose three just to finish quickly. So the first is the term disruptive has been mentioned a bunch of times, and I think there's a question of whether quantum technologies are disruptive and for whom. Yesterday, Michael called quantum mechanics a potentially disruptive technology that pointed out that new technologies like quantum can drive radical social change. And this is, of course, true and has happened at times. But if we're going to take seriously the proposition that quantum could be disruptive, let alone emancipatory, which is a whole other question, then I think we need to ask, who are these nimble outsiders that are developing these technologies? In order to take on legacy institutions, which is the core principle of disruption, right? And or at what point will access to these technologies be democratized and available to the many in ways that actually allow people to challenge existing institutions? Is that even in the realm of possibility in these technologies we're developing? Of course, we know that power is often zero-sum in these systems, and I worry that the interests of those developing these technologies will determine who is empowered by them. The second is, who is competing to get these technologies? And is there a tension between and within these alliances that we've heard of people who are developing them? I really heard a tension, I think, throughout some of our discussions here between this open spirit of cooperation about the labs and the countries that are developing these technologies and their real opportunity at the core of their incentives for strategic, scientific, and commercial gain. And at some point, those have to bump up against each other. And I just don't think we've really seen that. Michael even pointed out that we're now at a stage in quantum technologies where it's moved from a thing to study to a thing to exploit. And if that's the case, then people are going to want to monopolize these capabilities. And what does that mean? Put another way, I really liked how Bentley framed this, that how is this arrangement of interests shaping the kind and character of science that we get? And I think we really need to look at who's funding what, who's doing what, what's being done in secret, what's being done in open, and what the incentives of all those different actors are. And the final question I would just raise is how should we think about the governance of quantum technologies? In order to control the digital space, as like the Palantir analogy shows, we need both data and the tools to give them meaning. It is this capability that I think appears so seductive about quantum computing, that it could bring meaning. And with this meaning, I think we have to recognize will become control and power. And this also opens up a wide range, of course, of governance challenges, not just over the bad things that could happen with some of these technologies, which I wish we would talk more about. Just what are the crazy scenarios of how bad this could get? We've heard glimpses of it, but also over who has access to the meaning and control that quantum computing could enable. I think I'll leave it at that.
Excellent, thank you.
First, let me begin by thanking James and the organisers for having me here. This has been one of the most stimulating couple of days I think I've ever spent in an academic conference. It's been really a privilege, so thank you very much for that. And I guess what I want to do is I want to focus my questions on really the kind of core question, I think, for myself and for the other social scientists in the room, which is what can quantum theory offer us as social scientists? Or I decided I wanted to take the social science bit out of it and narrow it, or perhaps broaden it, to what can quantum theory offer students of politics, and in particular international politics. And I want to do this by telling you something about the kind of core problems that I'm facing in my own kind of new big project, which I think raise some of the issues. And then I want to talk about different ways in which, in the discussions that we've had, we've talked about what quantum can offer, and in a sense to kind of work through each of those against my own project and perhaps problematize them or highlight their advantages. So let me begin by telling you what I'm working on at the moment. I'm just starting a big project on the relationship between cultural diversity and international order. And the best way I find to introduce that to people is to say, look, there's a hell of a lot of anxiety in Western capitals at the moment about the rise of non-Western great powers, China, India, others. Now that's not just an anxiety about the kind of instability that normally accompanies great power transitions, which IR has told us a lot about over the years. It's a cultural anxiety. It's an anxiety about the potential influence of peoples who might have different values than us, that will seek to shape the international order in a way that is inconsistent with the order that we, the West, created over the last 200 years. Now, this particular way of talking, and it was put very nicely by some Lowy Institute scholars who said, look, Australians are just going to have to get used to the fact that the rules are going to be written by people who aren't like us. Now, this particular way of thinking about the contemporary international predicament is, I think, consistent with the kind of dominant strand of international relations scholarship on culture and international order. And that scholarship says that international orders grow out of unitary cultural contexts, the West, and cultural diversity is corrosive of order. And in international relations, the alternate position from that is a sort of variant of a liberal pluralist argument. It says, look, don't worry about that. Culture doesn't matter because culture dissolves into preferences and liberal institutions can accommodate states with different preference configurations, different cultural backgrounds. So we have a kind of essentialist argument on the one hand, and then we've got an argument that dissolves culture away as an issue in international politics. Now this way of thinking seems to be deeply problematic at multiple levels. And the first and I think most important is that this way, the essentialist way of thinking about culture, is stunningly incompatible with at least 20 years of work in anthropology, cultural studies, sociology, that tells us there is no such thing as a unitary culture. All cultures are highly variegated, internally contradictory, loosely integrated, deeply interpenetrated with one another, to the point where some anthropologists say we should give up talking about cultures and study the organisation of diversity. Now, IR scholars, in comparison to that view, are working with 1930s conceptions of culture. The liberal view is a proposition. John Eikenberry's argument that the liberal international order can accommodate rising powers is a theoretical proposition. We have no empirical work to demonstrate that that would be true. So what I want to do is that I want to launch a big project that actually looks more systematically at what the actual relationship between cultural diversity and international order is. Sometimes, perhaps, cultural diversity in certain guides and modes can be corrosive of order, but we also know, because historians tell us, that almost every international order in history grew out of a heterogeneous cultural context. So diversity can be generative of order as well as corrosive. So I think the starting point in these discussions shouldn't be something like a unitary culture being corroded by diversity, but the starting point should be diversity and how is order constructed in the context of diversity. But the problem is, how do we think about diversity and cultural diversity? And this is going to be the hook that I want to hang my comments on. Constructivists, who are one area that have talked a lot about cultural things, I think gave up the candle on this one some time ago when they made the turn to talk about norms. When they disaggregated the cultural into simply norms that you can study as individual variables, and then when you talk about the relationship between norms, you talk about grafting or nesting between norms, what they lose is, that certainly potentially captures diversity in cultural formations. But what it loses is that cultural formations, for all of their heterogeneity, are also patterned and structured and characterised by processes and practices and regularised forms of interdependency and connection, and even their contradictions bind as much as they divide. How do we talk about something that is something that is heterogeneous but also patterned and structured in certain ways? And for me, that's one of the conceptual issues in trying to think about this project. So what about quantum? Does quantum help me with this? Now, in the discussions that we've had here, I think I've seen a number of possible arguments about the role that quantum can play in the social sciences or for the study of politics. So let me go through them. First one I want to get rid of really quickly. In a number of discussions, particularly by the social scientists, and Alex raised it again today, there was an idea that quantum is strategically useful for those of us who do interpretive social science. It's like a kind of trump card against the positivists. Well, guys, look, we've got a scientific foundation for an interpretive approach to the study of politics and society. Trump. And the idea, I think, is that if we can do that, then suddenly the door will open to us and interpretive scholarship will suddenly become more acceptable and more influential. I want to get rid of that one because, frankly, even if it's true at the level of scientific propositions, it's not true at the political level. There are a whole series of reasons why interpretive scholarship struggles to find a voice against hardcore positivist work, and only part of that is about the model of science that undergirds positivist scholarship. There's a whole sorts of other things to do with professionalism, to do with models of scientific knowledge building, not just science itself. And I think we should just leave that one aside and concentrate on the other potential advantages. which I would see as having come up in the conversation, being, first of all, Alex Wendt's kind of thick argument in my eye. And it's not thick and stupid, but thick in fact, I think the book is deeply smart. But thick in the sense that Alex wants to, as Alex said, when the image of the turtles came up, Alex thinks it's quantum all the way down. We're just wave functions, okay? So you can take quantum theory and you can just apply it to the social, because the social is just part of that whole physical universe. Now, I have to say I have some qualms about that, but also the physicists who talk to us about that have qualms about that. So that one would seem to me to be, as Alex says, that's in the realm of kind of conjecture. That's a bold proposition. Let's see how it flies. We'll wrestle with it. Does it help me that much with the kinds of questions I'm interested in? Does it help me to grapple with the question of meaning, which is central to culture? Does it help me grapple with the relationship between heterogeneity and patternedness or structureness in cultural formations? I don't know. I can't see it. I was left going, yeah, okay, the revelation will come at some point, but I can't see it immediately. So what about the other ways it can be used? Well, one of the ways, and I think actually Karen, did the best example of how this might work, is that quantum can be used metaphorically or analogically, that we can take concepts from quantum that are useful to help us make sense of certain forms of complexity. And I think that's potentially very powerful. I think that's one of the areas where quantum can really help us. And I think that was also Jairus' point in his keynote. The question that I have there is quantum concepts against what other conceptual tools that we might have available to us. Jairus was able to present his account of affect with very little direct reference to concepts out of quantum. In fact, you could have taken the quantum out of it and it would have still been a beautifully compelling presentation on affect. And in fact, when we have been trying to describe the social universe here, we've been enlisting concepts, actually half, if not most of the time, concepts not out of quantum, but concepts out of other branches of social and cultural theory to do this. So the question is, what is it that the quantum concepts are adding that we don't already have in resources that are in other social disciplines and fields? I don't know the answer to that, but I think it's one that we need to ask ourselves. The third approach, which I think is actually associated with James's position, and we saw this in the movie last night, which I thought was fantastic, is that, hey guys, it's not just that the quantum concepts are useful for understanding the social world, but that the world is quantum, or world politics has become quantum in some way. And this is often linked to an argument that it's which you talked about, which is it's the technologies. This new technological revolutions has come in and it's transforming the nature of security, changing the nature of war. So quantum itself is, the world is becoming more quantum, and quantum, understanding quantum can give us better purchase on that. And perhaps the concepts from quantum can give us a better purchase on that, although, and this is back to my second point, I actually think that's an open question. It may be that that the world is changing in response to quantum technology, but that quantum concepts may or may not be the best way to understand the effects. They certainly will help us to understand the origins, but to understand the effects, I think, is another thing. So this leaves me, where I end up being left is I think I end up with a series of questions for those who wish to take quantum forward. And those questions, or let me pose them as challenges. I think the challenges are to try and work out exactly what are the different ways in which we can think about bringing quantum into the engagement with questions of peace and security. Are those different ways compatible with one another? And then how do you take that forward in concrete kind of more concrete theoretically, but also concretely in terms of kind of research programs. And here I'm just really conscious, I really don't want to sound like Robert Cohen. By the way, feminists, it's all really good, but you just need a research program that looks like mine. That's not what I'm suggesting. What I'm suggesting is that I think the next stage of this work actually needs to be in the area where we go, in a sense, where we start from the problem in peace and security, and then we work back saying, how does quantum theory help us with that very specific problem, and understanding it and coming to grips with it? Because I think we've come at it the other way, what is quantum theory, and we're kind of approaching peace and security out there. I think we now need to turn that around. So I'll leave it on that.
Thanks, James. I don't presume to have anything profound or even interesting to add to my learned panelist colleagues, but let me offer a few observations from the perspective of a funder. And let me first say that I'm a professional conference goer, and I always enjoy going to James's events because they truly are unique in the best sense of the word, and I think the last couple of days are a further testament to that. I've been thinking about whether there is such a thing as quantum philanthropy. And forgive me for this, but as I was sitting there the last couple of days, I was thinking, what is a grant proposal if not a potentiality, leavened with uncertainty? And the problem with that, of course, is, as Alexander Pope reminded us, that a little learning and knowledge is a dangerous thing. And my rudimentary knowledge of quantum has led me into these mind games that I've been playing as I've been sitting there. And if you forgive me for using other metaphors and analogies, you may recall the movie The Sixth Sense, where the little boy kept seeing dead people everywhere. So as I've been sitting here the last couple of days, I'm seeing quantum everywhere. And of course the danger of thinking the way I am is that I can leap to unsubstantiated conclusions and go overboard with my little mind games. And my wife, who's on the island working somewhere, tells me I have terrible analogies and metaphors, and I don't know how I ever got a good mark on the SATs. So there's a whole section in the American system to get into college. But what I was thinking about the famous character in the Moliere play who discovered that he'd been speaking prose all his life. And what my hope is that someday I'm going to wake up and think, wow, I've been dealing with quantum all my life and not even realizing it. And I remember that conference I went to in Australia where I started thinking about this. Well, of course, the challenge, as several of the participants here have put their finger on, it was first Colin who said, it is so difficult to explain, and there's so many different interpretations of quantum that it hasn't entered the public discourse. And then John Joe said, of course, that how to communicate a complex idea such as this, any complex idea, but particularly this one, is a central challenge. So for people like me, who at a certain level find this whole notion and the whole subject of this conference quite engaging and interesting, it presents a communication challenge when I re-enter the so-called real world. And the interesting thing, of course, for those who don't know, the Carnegie Corporation is literally on Madison Avenue. And that presents a whole other set of challenges about how to market ideas that people like me might think are interesting to the people that are actually making decisions, like our board and others. And as Chris put in a much more articulate way than I can, the central challenge for people like me who are supportive of exploring and investigating the implications of this very engaging notion is twofold. Well, it's manyfold, but at least from my modest perspective, the first one, of course, that Chris was talking about, what are the implications of quantum technology, and in particular quantum computing, for war and peace and for all kinds of things from drug development to you name it. And then there's I won't say quantum leap, but there's the leap into the Alexander Wendt argument of the implications of the entire world being a quantum wave pattern, and that we have to revolutionize our whole way of thinking. Well, certainly from a communication standpoint, the first part is a much easier case to make. Time magazine had a cover story on it, and it has entered some of the popular discourse, but certainly not in the Wendt level. It is this notion that if we have a quantum computer, there are all kinds of amazing things that can happen for good and ill. And I was thinking about Jairus's amazing presentation the other night, and you'll forgive me for my gross simplification of your profound remarks, but I was thinking about this notion of affect and how, in most cases, as I understand it, the empirical reality, there's a disjuncture between the empirical reality and what happens how it's taken by the world and its affect. And I think climate change, as Karen was talking about, the arrow is usually a small event, has an overblown implication for the world, and is treated in a different way. It seems to me with climate change, the arrow is going the other direction, where the empirical reality, if we accept it, and if you're not a Republican candidate for president, goes in the opposite direction, that in fact the affect is much lower. And I was thinking about quantum, and as I was dreaming about quantum philanthropy and seeing it everywhere, I was thinking that there is this juncture, or I'd like to think there's this juncture between what we know about quantum and how it's being understood and appreciated in the real world. And to bring it down to reality, I'm glad I have a long flight home. I actually had an email from my communications office, and they wanted me to tweet out, and of course I gave them your hashtag. And I wrote back and I said, yeah, I can't do justice in 140 characters to everything I'm trying to absorb here. And I have a 26-hour flight back, and hopefully I'll again not watch Hangover 3 and try to come up with some thoughts that will be useful for people like me who would like to see philanthropy get ahead of the curve on these kind of issues. And this brings me to my concluding observations about philanthropy, since I've been in this business for a while. And philanthropy is a field in search of causes. And I've told this story many times, but when the great Andrew Carnegie established the Carnegie Corporation in 1911, it was with $125 million, which in those days sounds like a lot. It sounds like a lot now. But the U.S. federal budget was $680 million at that time. So, we're putting real money on the table. Now, Andrew Carnegie, of course, tried to abolish war. He had some large ambitions, didn't quite succeed. We're still trying. But philanthropy these days, obviously, a comparable figure would be $500 billion or whatever. I'm no mathematician compared to the U.S. federal budget if philanthropy were trying to address these issues. So you've got the Ford Foundations of the world and other foundations. Ford just emerged from a 2-year exploration of the cause that they're going to try to address, and it's inequality. Certainly a worthy cause to try to address. The question is, how are they going to operationalize that in a way that their resources, as large as they are still quite modest given the nature of the challenge and the other funding sources in the world. Every American foundation I know, including my own, keeps looking for something that they think is amenable to philanthropic intervention. The problem is, and this is the problem I see looming with me making the case for quantum, is that there is, I know I'm on tape here, but maybe I won't be quoted, there is a kind of institutional ADD in the philanthropic world, where despite the fact that the evaluative metrics are woefully underdeveloped, as we all know, trying to affect social change, positive social change in particular, is a many-causal, complicated undertaking. And there is this evaluation industry that's grown up that thinks it can quantify this in a way that is a positive force. Well, I can tell you that having been evaluated many times and our grantees evaluated, it doesn't quite work that way. But because of this so-called institutional ADD, there is a inherent level of impatience in the philanthropic world, and dare I say, the new philanthropists are even more impatient because a lot of the pardon the people, I think there's some people here from Silicon Valley, but the new philanthropists that have made their money in the entrepreneurial spirit of Silicon Valley and did it rather quickly in usual business terms, feel that solving world's problems are also amenable to quick fixes, and they want to see the results even faster than, say, some of the older foundations out there. So the challenge for people like me will be, I haven't figured this out yet, is to try to make the case that there is something here, I believe there's something here, that is worthy of further exploration, but it may not result in something that I can go to my board and announce as this great achievement that can be quantified by the bean counters in the evaluation world. So I will end there because we know where the path to good intentions sometimes leads. I'm not saying that that's where we're leading, but I'm struggling to find a way to articulate the energy, the intellectual curiosity, all the ideas presented around this table in a way that will resonate with the very classical framework in which philanthropy operates, and which I would hope, and I'll close with one anecdote, and again, I've told this many times, and I'm looking for the analogy between this and quantum. Carnegie Corporation supported the great Swedish sociologist Gunnar Myrdal's book on race in America, and forgive me for those who've heard this story before, for me. And it was commissioned in 1939, and World War II came in the way of the completion of it. Finally completed in 1946 or 47, I forget. And it was not only did it languish on the bookshelves at that point, but it was essentially disavowed by the funder, which happens to be the organization that now employs me, and it was forgotten, basically. And then in 1954, when the famous Brown v. the Board of Education Supreme Court case was in the news, it was pulled down from the bookshelves, the dust was blown off, and it became the foundation for the argument in favor of the forces of light. Had the professional evaluators evaluated this in 1946 or 47, indeed in 53, they would have determined that this is a waste of philanthropic funding and should not have been done. Perhaps it goes without saying that timing is everything. I think James said that earlier in another context. But I'd like to think that making some kind of investment in these ideas would pay off down the road, so we won't look back and say, why didn't you guys focus on this very important development? So I'll end there. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. So while you're on tape, you will entertain a renewal for the grant then. Don't advance that. What I think has been illustrated here is that we have made progress in many ways. One, when we first started this, we were concerned attaching quantum to anything but mechanics would lead to confusion or ignorance, or in some cases even outright hostility. We now have more of a fluency in it, and I think also a rigor than when we did Q1. We also are looking at more, I think we've drilled in, gotten into the specifics of where it's popping up in a lot of different parts of consciousness, of matter, of metaphysics, that are going to have an impact on the world, and certainly in our smaller part of that world, peace and security. But it's also that I think that, as you pointed out and Chris did, that really we're responding to a global condition, and call it international order turning into international disorder. I like the word heteropolarity because I'm desperately trying to get into the Oxford English Dictionary, but it's a lot of different actors, not just like states. And this is why, as I was comments, I would say, when so many of the, actors and players of global violence now are non-state, it's hard to agree with that trend of Pinker and others and Goldstein of violence declining. So that if you look at it from heteropolarity, a lot of different actors having asymmetrical impact, largely because of their access to global media. Then I think also we have to ask what happens when quantum power enters into this. Okay? So that's my initial concern, and one that has motivated me to hold these things, because it's not an academic exercise. This is a genuine concern, and I think it should be one that is publicized. And the peril potential question as well is how do we help nudge that closer to the promise as opposed to the perilous. Okay, with that, let's open it up. Comments? Colin Slahan, go please.